The ship cost 18,000 credits Joran Vest did not have. He had 300 liquid, a station emergency line of credit he had been avoiding for 8 months because the interest rate was the financial equivalent of a slow drowning, and a reputation so thoroughly damaged that the automated cargo routing systems had started rejecting his bids without human review. The algorithms had decided he was a bad risk. The algorithms were probably right. He stood in the observation deck of Titan Station's secondary shipyard and watched the auction lots drift past the reinforced windows like mechanical fish in an aquarium, and he did the math he had been doing for 3 days. The emergency line would give him 20,000 at 19% compounding interest. Ruinous. Catastrophic. If he bought something unreliable and couldn't generate revenue fast enough to service the debt. But if he bought something good, something that could actually haul freight competitively, something that wouldn't strand him in the outer system with a failed drive and no rescue budget, the math worked. Barely. The way a bridge works when you've removed most of the structural members and are crossing it very quickly. He needed a ship, a real ship, not the category of vessel he'd been limping around in for the past 2 years. He needed it at a price that left him room to breathe. He had not expected the universe to take that requirement literally. Lot 17 drifted into view, rotating slowly in the pressurized display space beyond the plexiglass, and Joran felt the particular sensation of someone who has been looking for water in a desert and has just seen something that might be a mirage. The Verilia was beautiful in the specific, utilitarian way that made people who spent their lives in space go slightly weak. Clean lines, no wasted geometry, the compact muscularity of a vessel designed to work rather than impress. Marcus-class freighter, the auction listing read, a designation he knew well, a workhorse configuration that could handle anything from bulk ore to cold cargo, jump-capable, with the kind of drive redundancy that meant you came home even when something went wrong. Ships like this traded for 60, 70,000 on a good day. More if they were in the condition this one appeared to be in. The starting bid flashed on his data pad. 15,000. Joran stared at the number for a long moment. There were perhaps 40 people in the observation gallery, salvage operators, corporate procurement agents, the occasional private collector who bought ships the way other people bought art. They were all looking at the Verilia. He watched several of them type queries into their data pads, watched the queries apparently return results that caused faces to change in subtle, interesting ways. The auctioneer, a Martian with the anxious energy of a man standing on something that might not be solid ground, gestured at the ship with practiced enthusiasm that did not quite reach his eyes. Fully functional hyperdrive, he said. Grade 3 shielding. Cargo capacity 200 metric tons. Life support independently maintained for approximately 7 months. All systems certified operational by station engineers last week. Why so cheap? Called a woman near the back. She had the rings and the calculating eyes of someone who had survived at least 2 corporate collapses and was not in the habit of ignoring red flags. The auctioneer's smile developed a micro-tremor. Previous owner encountered some navigational difficulties. Minor crew turnover issues, nothing affecting core functionality. Crew turnover, the woman's voice sharpened. You mean they died? I mean they left voluntarily. The records are somewhat incomplete. The woman looked at her data pad. Something on the screen caused her to stand abruptly, mutter something about feeding schedules, and leave the gallery at a pace that was not quite running but wanted to be. Joran watched her go. Feeding schedules. His finger hovered over the bid button. Every instinct developed across 10 years of freelance hauling told him to put the data pad in his pocket and walk away. The instincts were specific and well-reasoned. Ships did not go cheap without a reason. Life support running for 7 months with no crew meant either spectacular negligence or something had prevented the previous owners from shutting it down. And the phrase crew turnover issues from a man who was sweating in a climate-controlled room was not the description of a minor administrative problem. His bank account had a different opinion. His bank account pointed out, with the cold clarity of a number that had 3 digits where it needed 5, that sometimes the only available option was the suspicious one, that the emergency credit line existed precisely for moments when waiting for a better opportunity was not a viable strategy, that 19% compounding interest on a vessel that could actually generate income was survivable in a way that continued financial freefall was not. He bid 18,000, Joran called, his voice carrying across the gallery with more confidence than he felt. The auctioneer's relief was so visible it was almost embarrassing. No competing bids came. The gallery had thinned noticeably since the woman with the rings had departed. Whatever the data pads were returning when people queried the Verilia's history, it was performing an effective sorting function. Going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. Sold. Just like that, Joran Vest owned a starship. He felt simultaneously elated and comprehensively terrified, the specific emotional combination of a man who has just won something he cannot afford to lose. The transfer documentation took an hour. Biometric scans, digital signatures, the activation of the emergency credit line with its 19% interest rate sitting in the fine print like a patient, professional threat. The docking attendant who handed him the access codes and maintenance logs had the demeanor of someone delivering a package they did not want to think about too carefully. Good luck, the attendant said. The tone suggested he had replaced the word luck with a different word in his head and was being polite about the substitution. The walk from the station umbilical to the Verilia's airlock was longer than the schematic suggested it should be. Joran's boots rang against the metal gangway with a hollow echo, and he used the time to compose a mental inventory of everything he knew about the ship, which was the official specifications, 7 months of unmanned life support operation, 17 previous owners over 40 years, and the fact that every person who had looked into its history at today's auction had decided not to bid. He was about to board a ship that 40 people with access to the same information he had looked at and walked away from. This was either the best deal of his career or the last decision of his life. He had made peace with not knowing which. The airlock accepted his codes immediately. The door opened with a hydraulic sigh, releasing a breath of recycled air that carried something unexpected, a faint scent, copper-edged and organic, sweet in a way that was not unpleasant but was entirely out of place on a vessel that had been running unmanned for 7 months. He cataloged it, filed it under Investigate Later, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, emergency lighting strips painting the corridors in pale blue. Clean. Too clean, he noticed this immediately, the absence of the usual lived-in texture of a working freighter. No scuff marks on the corridor walls, no personal items left in transit, no evidence of the small accumulations that people left behind in spaces they inhabited. The ship looked like it had been sterilized. He found the bridge without difficulty and slid into the pilot's chair with the specific relief of a man who has been standing for too long. The controls responded to his touch, panels lighting in sequence, and for a moment the Verilia felt exactly like what it was supposed to be, a good ship at a good price, waiting for someone to put her to work. Initializing, said a voice from the speakers. Welcome aboard, Captain. I am Blink, your onboard AI assistant. Blink, Joran repeated. It is an acronym, Biological Logistics and Integrated Navigation Kernel. Someone had too much time on their hands. Run a full diagnostic, everything. Acknowledged, beginning system survey. The voice cut out. When it returned, it had an odd distorted quality as though accessing files through interference. Previous owner, dietary requirements, critical, apologies accessing historical logs, files corrupted, attempting reconstruction. Joran frowned at the ceiling. He fired up the engines while Blink worked, feeling the thrumming power translate up through the deck plates and into his spine. Whatever else was wrong with the Verilia, Her core systems were exactly as advertised. Strong, responsive, alive in the way that good engines felt alive. He disengaged from the station and moved out into Saturn's neighborhood, those impossible rings of ice and rock catching the distant sun and throwing light in all directions. Titan Station shrank behind him as he navigated the traffic lanes toward open space, and Blink spoke again. "Captain, I should inform you that the cargo bay contains several items of interest." "What kind of items?" "7 stasis pods, standard medical grade, all empty." Joran's hands tightened on the controls. Empty as in never used, or empty as in something came out. The locks were forced open, from the inside. He sat with this information for a moment. The copper-sweet smell in the recycled air, the 2 clean corridors, 7 months of life support with no registered crew, 17 owners in 40 years. Then he laughed, because the alternative was a different kind of sound entirely. "Of course they were. I bought a haunted spaceship, that's just perfect." "I do not believe in haunted ships, Captain. The mechanisms for haunting as described in human folklore are not physically consistent with." "That makes one of us blink." The AI went quiet. Joran steered them further from the station, running the numbers in his head with the practiced compulsiveness of someone who has learned that calculation is a form of control when everything else is uncertain. He had 16 days of rations aboard. He had functional hyperdrive, grade 3 shielding, and a cargo bay full of empty stasis pods. He had an AI with corrupted historical files and an apparent difficulty accessing certain ship systems. He had a credit line at 19% compounding interest and a ship that had had 17 owners in 4 decades, which averaged to a new owner roughly every 2.5 years, none of whom had apparently left voluntarily according to the station records. He spent the first hour cleaning the control panels with disinfectant wipes and telling himself this was routine maintenance rather than displacement activity. The lights in the corridor outside the bridge flickered and died for exactly 4 seconds. "Blink, what was that?" "Power fluctuation in Section C, cause unknown." "You're the ship's computer. You're supposed to know everything on this ship." "I am experiencing difficulty accessing certain systems. It is as if portions of the ship are deliberately obscured from my monitoring functions. Additionally, I have found 17 references in my programming to biological integration protocols that I cannot fully parse. The log suggests the Virilia was modified to." Static erupted from the speakers, sharp and absolute. Then music. Old Earth jazz, the kind with upright bass and saxophone that belonged in smoky rooms in cities that no longer existed, playing with the casual confidence of something that had been waiting to be heard. It ran for exactly 12 seconds. Then silence. Joran stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Blink." "Nothing." "Blink, that better have been a system error." Another 30 seconds of silence, which on a ship-wide AI system was roughly equivalent to a human clearing their throat before saying something difficult. "Apologies," Blink said finally. "I cannot identify what triggered that audio file." "Fantastic." Joran stood stretching muscles that had tightened with hours of careful stillness. He took the plasma torch from the emergency locker, not much as weapons went, but it could cut through a bulkhead at close range, and a capacity for structural damage was better than nothing, and went to check the crew quarters. The corridor felt longer than the schematic, in the way that corridors feel longer when you are aware of being the only sound in them. The sleeping bay was cold, noticeably cold despite the environmental systems claiming optimal temperature, and the bunks had been made with a military precision that had nothing to do with the last human crew. Something had pulled those sheets tight. On the desk beside the captain's quarters sat a mug, half full of something that had evaporated long ago into a dark residue ring. Joran touched the rim. His finger came away with an oily film. He made the mistake of smelling it. Copper and that sweet organic scent, concentrated, almost overwhelming. He turned to leave and stopped. The scratches were on the wall beside the door. Long, deliberate marks carved into the metal plating, not random damage, not equipment wear, but something that had taken time and intention, forming patterns that resembled letters in a language he did not recognize. The edges of the marks were bright, the surface coating freshly scraped away. Blink scanned these marks. What do they say? Scanning, analyzing, translation complete. The word is awake. Joran read the single word carved into the metal of his ship's crew quarters and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up in the ancient, reliable way that the human nervous system communicates something is very wrong here. The ship has been empty for 7 months according to station records, he said. Yes, Captain. Those marks were made within the last 72 hours. Yes, Captain. Those two facts are not compatible. No, Captain, they are not. He backed out of the quarters without turning around, keeping the scratched wall in sight until the corridor swallowed it. His hand was on the plasma torch before he was consciously aware of reaching for it. He moved back to the bridge with the controlled speed of someone who is not running, but is not running either. Right, Joran told the empty air. This is fine, completely fine. I own a ship that carves messages on its own walls. This is a normal Tuesday. It is actually Thursday, Blink offered. Not helping Blink. The bridge felt safer, smaller, more manageable. He pulled up the full ship schematic and went through it section by section: cargo bay, engineering deck, life support hub, medical bay, all showing nominal readings, all green across the board. Nothing wrong according to every sensor on the ship. Nothing wrong at all. Blink, pull up the crew manifest, every registered owner, all 17. Records show average ownership duration of 2.3 years, Blink said. I have also located a notation in the maintenance logs, dated 11 months ago. Read it. Feeding schedule must be maintained. Failure to comply results in the remainder of the file is corrupted. Joran sat very still in the pilot's chair. Feeding schedule, he said, like what the woman at the auction mentioned. Yes, Captain. I believe she left before placing a bid. I noticed that, Blink. I definitely noticed that. He was still processing the specific implications of a ship with a feeding schedule and 17 owners who had all departed within 2.5 years when the lights went out. Not a flicker this time. A complete, definitive absence of illumination, leaving only the dim glow of the control panels and the vast dark of Saturn's outer system through the viewports. And in the sudden thick silence where the background hum of the life support systems seemed louder without the lighting to compete with it, he heard breathing. Not mechanical, not the ventilation system's familiar whisper. Something organic, something alive, moving through the corridor behind him with the unhurried purpose of something that had no reason to hurry. Joran brought the plasma torch up and spun the chair. He kept his thumb on the ignition switch and his eyes on the corridor, which was empty in the blue emergency light, deep shadows pooling in the spaces between the conduit runs. I don't know who you are, he said to the dark, but this ship is mine now, legally purchased, properly documented. If you're aboard, you're trespassing. Silence, 4 heartbeats, 5. Then a woman's voice, coming from somewhere he could not locate precisely, singing in a language that sounded like water moving over stone, like wind through deep canyons, like nothing his ear had any reference point for. It was genuinely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are entirely outside your experience, and it was the most frightening sound Joran Vest had ever heard. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds, then it stopped. Joran realized his hands were shaking, not dramatically, just the fine, persistent tremor of a nervous system operating at the edge of its tolerance. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. Sleep deprivation, stress response, auditory hallucination, completely reasonable explanation for everything. Your vital signs are elevated but otherwise within normal parameters, Blink said, making him flinch. I should also inform you that the medical bay lights have just activated. I did not trigger them. He looked down the corridor. Warm yellow light spilled from the medical bay doorway, inviting and wrong. He tightened his grip on the plasma torch and stood up. If I die tonight, Blink, make sure they know I got a genuinely excellent deal on this ship. Noted, Captain. Shall I include the final purchase price in the death notice? Sure, let's go out on a high note. He walked toward the light. The medical bay smelled of antiseptic and that copper-sweet scent that had followed him since the airlock, concentrated now into something almost overwhelming. Joran stood in the doorway with the plasma torch raised, scanning the room in the systematic way he'd learned in his first year of solo hauling, corners, under the examination tables, the space behind the equipment cabinets with the glass doors. Nothing. Examination tables, diagnostic equipment that was significantly more sophisticated than anything a standard freighter required, supply cabinets, a diagnostic bed that looked military grade. Everything still, everything normal. This is ridiculous, Joran muttered, stepping inside. I'm chasing shadows on my own ship like some kind of. The door behind him slid shut. He spun, touched the panel. Nothing. Blink, he said with careful measured calm. Open this door. The lights dimmed slightly. He felt it before he heard it, the absolute conviction of not being alone, the prey-brain signal that bypassed rational analysis entirely and communicated directly to the systems that made legs want to move. He turned slowly and found her in the corner near the supply cabinets. Tall, perhaps 6 feet, skin that shifted between deep emerald and pale pearl in the flickering light, catching it differently with every movement in the way of surfaces that were not quite any single color. Her hair fell past her shoulders in absolute black, and her eyes, when she turned to face him fully, glowed with a soft amber luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light, a glow that came from somewhere behind the iris, patient and steady. She wore a dark bodysuit that seemed to absorb the light around it. When she moved, barely a shift of weight, barely anything. It was with a fluid precision that communicated exactly what it meant to. This body had never once moved by accident. Joran's mouth was open. He was aware of this and could not do anything about it. His brain was still in the process of revising several fundamental assumptions about the universe. She looked at him with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen that has exceeded preliminary expectations, not warmly, but with genuine curiosity. Her head tilted in a way that was distinctly not human, a degree or two too far, held a second too long. "You bought my home," she said. Her voice was the one from the corridor. Melodious, accented with something he had no category for, speaking standard with the fluency of someone who had learned it long ago and had no particular attachment to how humans usually sounded. Joran's voice, when it came back, emerged approximately an octave higher than he would have chosen. "I have a receipt, legal transfer of ownership, signed and certified by Titan Station Commercial Authority, all proper documentation." Her smile was slow. The teeth were slightly too sharp at the corners. "Humans and their papers," she said. "You trade things that don't belong to you and call it law." She moved past him toward the examination table with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided, at some point, that physical space was primarily a suggestion, and ran one long finger along the surface. "I am Lysara. Before you ask what I am, understand that your species has not officially encountered mine. We prefer it that way." Joran ran through every alien species catalog he had ever studied. Nothing matched. The physical profile had elements, the ears tapering to elegant points, the bioluminescent eyes, the movement patterns that suggested things, but nothing coherent. Nothing he had been told was real. "The stasis pods," he said, "those were yours." "They were for me," she corrected. "The ship was stolen from my people's territory 73 years ago. I was forced into hibernation to conserve energy. The thieves who took the Verilia attempted to include me in their inventory, which did not work as they expected. She examined the medical scanner she had picked up with mild interest. I've been cycling between waking and sleeping since then, watching short-lived creatures purchase what was never theirs. Short-lived, Joran said. By your reckoning, I am 247 years old. She set the scanner down, quite young among my people. Joran absorbed this. He was still holding the plasma torch. He lowered it slightly because the specific situation had evolved past the point where a plasma torch felt like a relevant intervention. The ship isn't yours legally, he said, whatever your history with it. The ship is not mine or yours in any way your law recognizes, Lysara said. It was grown, not manufactured. It is a living organism bonded to my genetic signature. When your auction sold it to you, they were selling something they did not own and could not understand. She met his eyes, and her amber gaze was entirely steady. When you touched the controls and piloted it away from that station, you introduced your biology into its systems. It has been assessing you since. Assessing, Joran repeated. The Verilia consumes what you might call bioelectric essence, a combination of blood and life energy. It requires this to function at full capacity. She paused. It has been starving. He looked at the walls, looked at the ceiling, noticed for the first time something he had not registered consciously before. The walls had a texture under the metal plating that was not entirely mechanical. A faint patterning, almost organic, like the inner surface of something that had been grown rather than fabricated. Ships aren't alive, he said, knowing even as he said it that it was going to be wrong. Human ships are not. The plasma torch was definitely not going to be useful. Joran raised it anyway, because a man needed something to do with his hands. Listen, I don't know what kind of situation this is, but I'm going to fly this ship back to Titan Station right now, and we're going to let the authorities sort out whatever. The ship won't go where you tell it. Lysara's voice was not unkind. It carried the specific patience of someone delivering information that is true regardless of whether the recipient wants it. Try if you don't believe me. He did. He backed out of the medical bay, the door opened this time, which he noted, and retreated to the bridge and threw himself into the pilot's chair and told Blink to plot a course back to Titan Station, maximum speed. Acknowledged, Captain. However, the navigation system is not responding to standard input protocols. Primary directional control appears to have been assumed by the ship's biological core. On the main display, their trajectory shifted. They were not going back to Titan. They were accelerating outward, toward the Kuiper belt and the dark beyond. Override it. I cannot. I apologize, Captain. Lysara appeared in the bridge doorway. She leaned against the frame with the ease of someone for whom all outcomes of this conversation had already been considered. I told you. Joran worked the controls with increasing desperation, trying every command sequence he knew, every override protocol, every emergency directive. The Verilia ignored all of it with the serene confidence of something that had its own opinions about where it was going. How long until we run out of supplies? He said finally. Your standard rations, Blink said. Approximately 16 days. 16 days. He looked at her at those steady amber eyes, at the slight sharpness at the corner of her smile. And then what? You eat me. That is one option, Lysara said. She moved to the co-pilot's chair and settled into it, and even that motion, a person sitting down, looked different when she did it, like water finding its level. Or we could make an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? She considered him for a moment in the way she seemed to consider most things, with a thorough, unhurried attention that suggested she was used to having time. I need to feed. Not to kill. The Valier can take what we need in controlled amounts, enough to sustain ourselves without draining our source completely. In exchange, I teach you to command the Verilia properly. The ship will accept you eventually, once it completes its assessment, but that process requires time and knowledge you currently don't have. Joran leaned back in his chair and looked at the viewport, where stars were doing what they always did, which was being indifferent to the specific problems of small biological creatures. "So my options are," he said slowly, "become a living blood bank for a 200-year-old alien, or die in deep space when the food runs out." Essentially, Lysara examined her nails. "Though I find blood bank reductive, the Valier relationship with sustenance is considerably more nuanced than your folklore suggests." "Oh well, that changes everything." Joran closed his eyes for a moment. "I really should have listened when the woman with the rings left. Most people would have. Most people have more sense than available credit." She made a sound then, brief, almost surprised, that he would later recognize as the closest thing she had to a genuine laugh. He did not know that yet. It was just a sound, but he filed it away. The Verilia sailed on through the dark, and Joran Vest sat in the pilot's chair of a ship that had eaten 17 previous owners and was now making plans for its 18th, and thought about the specific sequence of decisions that had brought him here, and found that he could not identify the point at which a different choice would have led somewhere better. He had been running out of road long before he walked into that auction gallery. The first feeding happened 3 days later. He had spent those 3 days in a methodical survey of his options, every escape route, every communication possibility, every technical workaround, and had found nothing that the Verilia and Lysara between them had not already accounted for. The nearest inhabited station was 4 days at best speed, and they were not moving at best speed toward it. His suit communicator had range measured in kilometers. Blink's external communications were functional, but the Verilia's course through the outer system was keeping them beyond reliable relay distance. He had considered and rejected the plasma torch option on the grounds that Lysara had not, in 3 days, given him reason to believe she was lying about anything. And a woman 247 years old who moved like gravity was optional, had probably survived more plasma torch attempts than she cared to count. He had considered attempting to manually override the ship's biological navigation systems, and found that the access points were located in sections of the vessel that did not respond to his presence the way the bridge did. The ship allowed him there, but did not open to him, like a house where certain rooms remained locked to a new guest. On the morning of the 4th day, he rolled up his sleeve and sat on the examination table in the medical bay, and told himself that this was a practical problem with a practical solution, and that practical solutions sometimes involved discomfort. "This is definitely the weirdest Tuesday I've ever had," he said. "It is actually Thursday," Blink offered from the speakers. "Blink not now." Lysara held a small blade with the practiced ease of someone for whom this was a familiar procedure. She had explained the process with clinical thoroughness. A small incision, direct contact to facilitate the energy transfer, approximately 10 minutes, iron-rich food afterward. She had told him it would not hurt much. He would discover shortly that this had been an optimistic characterization. "Relax," she said. "Tension makes it worse." "Sure, let me just relax while you drink my life force." Her expression suggested she was choosing not to respond to this. She pressed the blade to his forearm. The pain was immediate and sharp, not terrible, but specific and undeniable. The pain of something being done to his body that his body had strong opinions about. Then her hand came down over the wound, cool against his skin, and he felt something pull. Not just blood. Something deeper, something that did not have a name in any medical terminology he knew, a current moving outward from somewhere that felt more fundamental than flesh, a drawing away of something he had not known was there until it was being taken. His vision blurred at the edges. A strange, heavy warmth settled over him, not pleasant, just wrong in the specific way of a natural process happening outside its natural context. He watched her through half-closed eyes. Her skin was changing, the pale, slightly papery quality he had noticed since their first encounter was brightening, the emerald tones becoming vivid, the amber glow in her eyes intensifying. She looked more present, more real, like something that had been running on emergency reserves returning to full capacity. When she finally withdrew, sealing the wound with a medical adhesive that worked faster than anything Joran had encountered in human medicine, he felt hollow. Not dramatically. He was functional, conscious, capable of independent movement. But something essential had a smaller quantity of itself than it had had 10 minutes ago. That was profoundly unpleasant, he said. His voice was thin. You'll recover fully in a few hours. Eat something high in iron. She stood, and the difference in her movement was impossible to miss. The renewed energy, the fluidity restored to something that had been slightly labored before without him quite registering it. She looked at him with an expression he could not interpret. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it. Seriously. Let's establish right now that we never discuss this." She almost smiled. He thought it might have been genuine. Over the following days, in the long hours between feeding intervals and navigation lessons, and the particular silence of deep space that was either peaceful or crushing depending on your mood, Joran learned things about the Virilia that no human ship manual had ever contained. The ship was not a standard hybrid of biological and mechanical systems. It was a Valier-grown organism that had been augmented with conventional technology, the mechanical components additions to something that had begun as purely biological, not the other way around. Its intelligence was distributed through its structure the way consciousness was distributed through a nervous system. It felt the space around it. It had preferences. It remembered. This was not a metaphor. "You're thinking too much," Lasara said during a navigation lesson that had been running for 40 minutes without producing a course change. They were trying to adjust toward an asteroid cluster in the mid-Kuiper belt, and the Virilia kept drifting back to its own heading with the serene stubbornness of a large animal that had decided it was going a particular direction. "The ship doesn't understand human navigation logic," she continued. "It doesn't understand coordinates as abstractions. It understands desire, purpose, the emotional reality of wanting to go somewhere. That's not how ships work. Human ships." She moved to stand beside him at the control panel, stop commanding it and start persuading it. She placed her hand over his on the panel, and he felt the ship systems hum differently at the double contact, a change in the quality of the vibration, something that was almost like attention. "Feel the ship. It is alive. Treat it as such." Joran closed his eyes. He tried to set aside everything he knew about navigation, the coordinates, the mathematical relationship between velocity and heading, the precise instrumental language of piloting, and tried instead to simply want. He thought about the asteroid cluster, not as a set of coordinates but as a destination, a place he wanted to go, somewhere with the quality of wanting attached to it. The deck plates shifted beneath him. The engine note changed. The Virilia turned. "There," Lasara said, removing her hand. "You're beginning to understand." "That shouldn't work," Joran said. "And yet here we are." She returned to the co-pilot's chair. "Your species builds dead machines and forces them into obedience. We grow living things and ask them to partner with us." She tilted her head. "Which do you find more rational?" Joran considered this honestly, and found he did not have a compelling counterargument. Their conversations accumulated across the days the way conversations do in isolation, gradually, without formal structure, depositing information in layers. The Valier were nomadic in the deepest sense, not culturally but philosophically. Their civilization's foundational belief was that consciousness was the only permanent thing, that physical form was temporary housing, that the self persisted through change rather than despite it. They measured time differently than humans did. They experienced loss differently. Death, for a Valier, was understood as a transition rather than an ending, which gave them a relationship with mortality that Joran found alternately enviable and troubling. "So your whole civilization is basically spacefaring philosophers with a blood-drinking habit." He said one evening over synthesized protein that tasted approximately like cardboard that had briefly met something claiming to be chicken. That's a reductive summary, Lysara said, but she made the sound again, the brief, slightly surprised sound that he was increasingly certain was a laugh. We are considerably more sophisticated than your folklore suggests. I notice you keep saying that. Because it keeps being relevant. He looked at her across the small table, the glow of her eyes in the dim light, the way she held herself with the particular self-possession of someone who had made peace long ago with exactly what she was. She was dangerous. He had not forgotten this. But she was also, he was discovering, darkly funny in a way that suggested she had decided at some point that if you were going to be a predator in a universe full of smaller, softer creatures, you might as well find it at least occasionally amusing. She was also, he thought with some discomfort, lonely. Not in a way she would ever acknowledge or probably even consciously recognize, but in the way of someone who had spent 70 years cycling between hibernation and brief wakefulness with a rotating cast of terrified strangers, none of whom had lasted and none of whom had mattered, and who had built a comprehensive set of behaviors around the fact of that isolation. He recognized it because it looked, in a different register, like his own last 2 years. Blink interrupted this thought with the timing that Joran was beginning to suspect was not entirely coincidental. Captain, I am detecting 3 vessels on an intercept course. Configuration matches Valier design patterns in my database. Lysara went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. It was not the stillness of someone at rest. It was the stillness of someone who had been expecting this and had not allowed themselves to fully believe it would happen. "Show me," she said. The main display populated with 3 ships moving through the dark with the coordinated grace of things that had hunted together for a very long time. They were beautiful in the organic way, flowing curves and bioluminescent pulses running along their flanks in patterns that looked more like the language of deep-sea creatures than the visual systems of warships. They were larger than the Verilia. They were faster. "Your people," Joran said. Yes, Lysara's voice had lost every quality that might have been called warm. They have been tracking us. I hoped we would have more time. Time to do what? She turned to look at him, and in her amber eyes he saw something he had not seen before in 3 days of careful observation. Something that looked like regret. The Valier do not take kindly to their vessels being removed from their territory without authorization. She paused. They consider both of us thieves. Me, for awakening and failing to immediately reclaim the ship. You, for bonding with something that was never meant for human hands. Joran processed this. What happens to thieves? Her silence was the answer he had expected and did not want. They surrounded the Verilia within an hour, sliding into a formation that made escape a mathematical impossibility, not a dramatic encirclement but a precise, patient arrangement of 3 vessels in the specific positions that closed every viable exit vector simultaneously. They did not fire. They did not transmit threats. They simply positioned themselves, which was more frightening than either of the alternatives. The communication came through audio Blink translating in real time through Joran's ear implant. A voice, melodious and cold, speaking the flowing Valier language. Lysara of the Twilight Reaches, you have violated protocol by permitting an unauthorized species to interface with a living vessel. Explain your reasoning. Lysara responded in her own language, rising and falling in the cadences he had heard in the corridor that first night, measured and formal, and he heard his own name in the stream of syllables, and felt the particular discomfort of being discussed in a language he could not follow. The response was sharp. Blink translated, the human's ignorance does not constitute excuse. He has contaminated the Verilia's biological matrix. The contamination cannot be permitted to stand. Contaminated, Joran said quietly. I didn't contaminate anything. I bought a ship at a station auction with proper documentation. They don't recognize human commercial law, Lysara said. I'm gathering that. She spoke again, her tone measured but carrying something firm underneath it. The response came quickly, carrying an edge that needed no translation, though Blink provided one. You will surrender the Verilia and submit to judgment. The human will be returned to his species with memories redacted. Noncompliance will result in permanent exile and termination of the contaminated vessel. Joran stood up. They're going to kill the ship. They view it as compromised beyond recovery. Lysara stood as well, and he noticed she was not looking at the display. She was looking at him. I'm sorry, Joran. I should have told you this might happen. When, between the part where you explained you were going to drink my blood and the part where you explained the ship wouldn't obey me. I understand you're angry. I'm not, he stopped. He was not, he realized. He was afraid, but the anger he might have expected was not there. He was running calculations. Can we fight them? 3 military vessels against 1 civilian freighter. Approximately 40 seconds. Run. Faster than us. They know the Verilia's navigation systems better than I do. Can we negotiate? The Valier don't, she stopped. Her head tilted slightly. There is one possibility. It is traditional but rarely invoked. Tell me. I could claim you as my bonded partner. A formal arrangement that would give you legal standing under Valier law to command the Verilia. It would make the contamination argument legally moot. She watched him with those steady amber eyes. But it is not a temporary arrangement. Bonding is permanent. You would be bound to me and this ship for the duration of your life. You would be leaving human space. You would live under Valier law and custom. Joran sat back down. He looked at the viewport, at the 3 alien vessels holding their perfect formation, at the impossible patience of something that had been hunting through the dark for a very long time. He thought about human space. He thought about 19% compounding interest on a credit line for a ship he no longer controlled. He thought about the cargo routing algorithms that had stopped accepting his bids. He thought about the 2 years of slow suffocation that had ended with him walking into an auction gallery and bidding everything he had left on a ship that turned out to be a living organism with a passenger. He thought about the Verilia turning when he asked it to, the deck plates shifting under him, the unmistakable sense of something vast and patient paying attention. What does being bonded actually mean, he said. What are we talking about practically? It is closest to what your culture would call a crew partnership with legal and biological components. She moved closer, not threatening, just present, that particular Valier quality of being fully in whatever space they occupied. The Verilia would accept you completely as co-commander. You would be under my protection and my responsibility. If you committed crimes, I would answer for them. Your well-being would be my legal obligation. She paused. And yes, the feeding arrangement would become permanent. Of course it would. Blink, do you have an opinion? Joran said. Statistically, memory redaction procedures carry a 15% risk of permanent cognitive impairment, Blink offered. Additionally, your current outstanding debts in human space have accrued to a level that would likely result in asset seizure and possible criminal proceedings upon return. The Verilia represents your only current registered asset. Thanks for that, Blink. You're welcome, Captain. Joran sat for a long moment in the ship that had been alive this whole time, listening to the Verilia hum around him, that constant vibration he had been hearing as mechanical and was now understanding as something else entirely. He thought about what the ship had felt like when it turned for him. The quality of that attention, something vast and ancient paying him the specific courtesy of taking him seriously. The tests, he said finally, if I agree to the bonding, what do they actually involve? Lysara's expression did something that he was learning to read as significant even before he knew what it meant. The trials are challenging. Most humans, she paused. They test whether you are capable of the bonding, physically, mentally, and in terms of purpose. How bad is challenging? Bad enough that the majority of your species would not complete them. Joran looked at the display, at the 3 ships waiting with infinite patience, at the trajectory that had brought him here across a year of gradual catastrophe and one very expensive auction bid. He looked at Lysara, this alien woman who had upended everything he thought he knew about the universe, who had kept her word in every specific way she had given it, who had shown him a ship that was alive and a sky full of impossible stars. "I'm not going back to human space with pieces of my brain missing," he said, "and I'm not going to let them kill the Virilia." She watched him. "You're certain?" "Absolutely not." He stood up. "But when has that ever been a prerequisite?" He moved to the communications panel. "Blink. Tell them, Lysara of the Twilight Reaches and her bonded partner request audience with the Council. We accept evaluation." Acknowledged. Transmitting. The wait was long enough that Joran had time to fully contemplate what he had just volunteered for. Then the response came, in rapid velar syllables that Blink translated with something that sounded, remarkably, like surprise. "Request granted. Proceed to transmitted coordinates. Be advised, the trials will assess every dimension of your worthiness. The consequences of failure are as significant as the consequences of refusal." The three ships adjusted their formation, creating a corridor through space. Lysara placed her hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him without it being the direct context of feeding, and the difference in the gesture registered clearly. Not the cool clinical contact of procedure, but something deliberate and chosen. "Thank you," she said, "for not taking the easier path." "Easy would have been not buying the ship in the first place," Joran said. "Everything since then has been a series of increasingly committed mistakes." She made the sound, the real one. He was certain now that it was a laugh. The Virilia moved toward the coordinates, carrying them out of Saturn's domain, and toward a judgment that neither of them could fully predict. The gathering point existed in a region of space that violated Joran's understanding of stellar physics, with the casual indifference of the universe, demonstrating that his understanding was a simplified model of a much more complex reality. Violet suns orbited crimson giants in configurations that suggested gravitational rules he had not been taught. Structures the size of moons drifted in formations that implied intelligence rather than inertia. And when the Virilia passed through what Lysara called the threshold, a region of space that looked like any other region of space, until they were through it and it did not, the ship responded in a way that Joran felt through the deck plates and the control panel, and somewhere deeper than either. It shuddered, not with distress, with recognition, the particular movement of something returning to a context it remembered. Dozens of velar vessels floated in formation around a central structure that was simultaneously the most alien and the most comprehensible thing Joran had ever seen. It was massive, station scale, larger, built entirely from grown materials in flowing curves and arching forms, that the functional military precision of human space infrastructure had no equivalent for. Bioluminescent veins pulsed through its surfaces in slow, rhythmic patterns. It looked like something that had been alive for a very long time. "The Council Nexus," Lysara said quietly. "I haven't seen it in over a century." "It's beautiful," Joran said, and immediately added, because honesty had become his default register in the past 2 weeks, also completely terrifying. "Most things that matter are both." They docked at one of the Nexus's many ports, and Joran discovered that walking through corridors that breathed was, as experiences went, something you either adapted to quickly or did not adapt to at all. The walls expanded and contracted in slow rhythm, temperature-regulated air moving through what were clearly respiratory channels in the structure's biology. The floor had a slight give underfoot, like dense organic material, like something that registered his weight. Other velar passed them, alone, in pairs, moving with that liquid economy of motion that Joran now recognized as culturally characteristic rather than individually notable. They looked at him with undisguised curiosity, not hostile, not welcoming, just the frank assessment of a people not accustomed to seeing what he was in a context like this. They're wondering if you'll survive, Lysara translated. That makes two of us. The council chamber was circular. 7 Valier were seated at elevated positions around the perimeter, arranged with the deliberate geometry of a space designed to communicate judgment. They looked ancient in the way that had nothing to do with physical decay. Their age was in their eyes, in the specific stillness of people who had accumulated so much experience that they no longer needed to perform patience, because patience had become their resting state. The eldest sat at the apex of the arrangement, silver threaded through absolute black hair, skin that shimmered between colors like the surface of something deep. When she looked at Joran, it was with an attention so complete that he felt briefly and entirely seen, not surveilled, not assessed, but actually seen. Lysara of the Twilight Reaches, she said, and Blink's translation arrived in Joran's implant a half-second later, slightly formal in its phrasing. You claim this human as bonded partner. Explain why we should permit what has never been permitted. Lysara stepped forward. Her posture shifted subtle, but Joran had spent 2 weeks watching her, and he caught the adjustment in her bearing, something that acknowledged the formal context without becoming something other than herself. Honored counsel, she said. Joran Vest bonded with the Verilia through circumstance, not malice. He purchased the ship according to his species' legal customs without knowledge of its true nature. When I revealed myself, he could have attempted to destroy me or flee the ship at the first opportunity. He chose neither. He agreed to coexistence, learned what I could teach him, and has demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that is not typical of his species. Adaptation is not the same as worthiness, said another council member, a man whose geometric scarring covered his face and hands, giving him an appearance that suggested a very long story that he did not seem inclined to summarize. He contaminated a living vessel. That alone warrants cleansing. The Verilia accepts him, Lysara said. The ship has not rejected his presence or his commands. Does the judgment of a living vessel count for nothing? It counts for curiosity, the eldest said. Curiosity is not the same as acceptance. She turned her attention to Joran, and the full weight of it was something he felt physically, like stepping into a stronger gravitational field. Human, do you understand what you're requesting? You would be severing the effective ties to your species, living under our customs, accepting limitations and responsibilities that may feel like confinement. Joran cleared his throat. He was aware of 7 ancient beings studying him with the focused attention of people who had seen a great many things and were evaluating whether this was one of them. Honored counsel, he said, and the formal address felt odd in his mouth but seemed like the right choice. I understand that I'm asking to join a culture I barely understand and commit to a life I never imagined. He paused, finding the true thing under the practiced phrasing. 6 months ago I would have told you what I wanted was simple: clear my debts, get a reliable ship, start over. Now he looked at Lysara briefly, then back at the council. I've spent 2 weeks learning that the universe is stranger and more interesting than I knew how to want. Going back to what I had before feels less like freedom and more like deliberately choosing blindness. One of the council members made a sound. The eldest's expression remained precisely unreadable. You will face 3 trials, she said: physical endurance, mental fortitude, and purpose. Many have entered these trials and not completed them. Are you prepared? No, Joran said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. The physical trial was called deep integration, and Lysara had described it as the ship testing whether your body can withstand extended bonding. This was accurate in the way that describing drowning as the lungs testing whether they can process water was accurate. Neural interfaces connected him to the Verilia's systems, not the surface connection of piloting the ship, not the peripheral awareness he had been developing across 2 weeks of navigation lessons, but something total. The ship's biology merged with his nervous system, and the Verilia poured itself into him. Its hunger, its memories, its vast and patient awareness of the space around it. Every cell in his body screamed simultaneously that this was wrong, impossible, a violation of the separation between self and other that kept consciousness coherent. His temperature spiked. His heart rate became something his chest could barely contain. His hands convulsed on the interface contacts. He survived by finding an analogy. He had nearly drowned once, as a child, in a recreational tank on a space station that had experienced an equipment failure. He remembered the moment of choice, the moment between fighting and letting the current take him, between the panic that spent energy and the stillness that conserved it. He had found the stillness then. He found it now. He stopped fighting the merger and let the Verilia move through him, let its enormity be enormous without trying to contain it. He existed inside its consciousness for what felt like hours and was probably minutes, feeling the ship know itself knowing him, and slowly, gradually, the screaming in his cells became something quieter. Not comfortable, not painless, but sustainable. He came back to himself shaking and exhausted with a new awareness of the ship around him that had not been there before, not hearing the vibrations as external sound, but feeling them as something more continuous. The mental trial was worse. His consciousness expanded into the Verilia's vast awareness, and suddenly he was not himself, but everything the ship had ever experienced, 200 years of memory flooding into him in a wave that had no consideration for the human mind's capacity to receive it. Previous owners screaming as they fled down the corridors. Lysara's voice singing in empty air, again and again, across decades of loneliness. The cold silence of deep space pressing against the hull across years of unmanned drift. The voices of people who had tried to command the ship and found it would not comply and had left, all of them, one after another, in fear or in fury or both. He felt himself dissolving, identity fragmenting at the edges, the boundary between Joran Vest and 200 years of accumulated experience becoming permeable, and then porous, and then something he was no longer certain existed. He held on to the only thing he was sure of. I am Joran Vest, failed hauler, bad gambler, man who spent his last viable credit on a ship he could not afford and did not understand and has no intention of abandoning now. He held on to the self-deprecation as a lifeline. He held on to the specific memory of the plasma torch in his hand on the bridge, the way he had not put it down even when it was useless, because a man needed something to hold. He held on to Lysara's laugh, that brief, surprised sound, and the way the Verilia had turned when he asked it to. He held on to himself until the wave receded. The final trial was held before the council, and Joran stood in front of 7 ancient beings who had watched him survive 2 impossible experiences and were now waiting to hear why. He was shaking. He had made no attempt to conceal the shaking because he did not have the energy to perform steadiness, and because the council had earned his honesty even if they had not asked for it. I cannot offer you centuries of experience, he said. I don't have deep knowledge of your customs or your history or most of what makes your culture work. What I can offer is this, he stopped, finding the right words. I'm human, which means I see the universe through a frame you don't have. I ask questions you might not think to ask because you've already answered them. I make mistakes that your experience has made you incapable of making, and some of those mistakes produce things that experience doesn't produce. He looked at the council, then at Lysara, who was watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something unguarded and still. Lysara has been alone for 70 years, not just without company, alone in the way of someone who has stopped expecting to be known. He looked back at the eldest. She doesn't need a perfect partner. She needs someone who shows up and tries. I'm not perfect, but showing up is something I know how to do. It's actually the only thing I've consistently managed. The council deliberated in their musical language, and Joran stood and tried not to visibly collapse, and the Verilia hummed around all of them. Finally, the eldest spoke. Your trials are complete. You have endured what your species rarely endures. The Verilia has accepted your presence in its deepest systems. Therefore, by the laws of the Valier people, by the evidence of the trials and the testimony of the living vessel, we accept the claim. She made a formal gesture that Lysara mirrored. Joran Vest, you are bonded to Lysara of the Twilight Reaches and to the Virilia. May you bring honor to this arrangement. She paused, or may it end you quickly. Joran managed a sound that was approximately a laugh. That's a remarkably ominous blessing. We are a practical people, the eldest said. And for the first time in the proceedings, something changed in her expression, not a smile exactly, but the acknowledgement of one. The Virilia felt different on the way out. Not different as in changed. The ship was what it had always been. Different as in something that had been present throughout and was now fully visible. The deck plates responded to his footsteps with an awareness that was not new but was newly undisguised. The engine vibration felt not like mechanical function but like breath. When he settled into the pilot's chair and placed his hands on the panel, the ship oriented itself toward him with the ease of something that had been waiting for this and was now finished waiting. Lysara took the co-pilot's position, and the quality of her movement was different too. The controlled precision was still there, but something underneath it had loosened. The armor that had been fully on since the moment she had stepped out of the medical bay shadows 2 weeks ago was not gone, but it was not the only thing visible anymore. So Joran said, I'm officially an alien's bonded partner now. You're officially a Valia-recognized co-commander of a living vessel with legal standing in Valia space, Lysara said. The phrasing matters. Right, how does it feel? He thought about it honestly. Strange. Terrifying. He looked at the viewport, at the impossible stars of the gathering point burning in their violet and crimson configurations that had no names in any human astronomy. Completely insane. He paused. But honest, you were right about that. Captain Blink said, I have updated your personnel file as required by Valia bonding protocols. Occupation, Valia bonded partner and deep space explorer. Salary, none currently established. Life expectancy, significantly uncertain. Thanks Blink, very motivating. You're welcome, Captain. I have also located the source of the jazz recording from your first day aboard. It was in Lysara's personal audio archive, flagged as automatic playback on new captain detection. She appears to have added it 43 years ago. Joran turned to look at Lysara. She was studying the navigational display with the focused attention of someone who has decided not to be looking at the person next to them. You programmed the ship to play jazz when someone new came aboard, he said. It seemed welcoming, she said to the display. It was extremely unsettling. Yes, she agreed, I may have misjudged the effect. 43 years ago. I was optimistic. He laughed, fully, freely, the laugh of someone who has come through something large and found that they are still themselves on the other side. A slightly different version, changed in specific ways that will take time to fully inventory, but recognizably continuous with the person who had walked into a salvage auction with 300 credits and an emergency line of credit and a last desperate gamble left in him. The Virilia hummed around them, warm and alive, carrying them through impossible stars. Lysara placed her hand over his on the control panel, not the clinical contact of feeding, not the formal gesture of bonding protocols. Just a hand on his hand, cool and deliberate and chosen. Where should we go, she said. Joran looked at the viewport, at the unmapped dark stretching endlessly outward, at the stars burning in colors that had no names yet, that would not have names until someone went far enough to find them and came back to say what they had found. He had bought a cheap ship. The ship had been alive. The ship had had a passenger. The passenger had needed his blood to survive. He had volunteered for trials designed to break him and had not broken. He had left behind a life that was ending anyway and stumbled into the beginning of something he did not have a word for. Anywhere, he said, everywhere. He felt the Virilia respond beneath him, that vast, patient awareness orienting toward the question the way it had oriented toward the asteroid cluster the first time he had asked rather than commanded. The ship wanted to go. The ship had always wanted to go. It had just been waiting for someone who asked the right way. "We've got time," Joran said. The Verilia moved into the dark, carrying them toward destinations that no human had mapped and wonders that had no names yet in any human language. And in the hum of a living ship moving through impossible stars, in the specific warmth of going somewhere with someone who had agreed to show up and keep showing up, Joran Vest discovered what he had actually been looking for when he walked into that auction gallery with his 300 credits and his borrowed money and his last available gamble. Not a ship. A direction. The Verilia sang them forward through the dark, and for the first time in years, the song felt like his.